An innocent woman teams up with the demon to carry out 3 human sacrifices to prevent an apocalypse. In 1979 England, a soft-spoken Indian woman named Nida resides in the predominantly white community of Tipley. She works at Possett's, a local shoe store, where she regularly faces discrimination from her co-worker, Vicky. Despite this, Nida remains resilient and continues to carry out her responsibilities at work. During her lunch break, Vicky orders her to assist the customer. To her surprise, it's Keith Holligan, a notorious ex-convict who murdered his wife. With no choice, Nida takes his shoe size, but he keeps making lewd remarks that disturb her. Despite her discomfort, she remains professional and guides Keith to the counter to complete his purchase. However, he ends up having to set the item aside because he can't afford it yet. With this, Nida writes his details on a slip, but Keith suddenly asks her to write her number 2. Fed up, she chokes him until he struggles to breathe. However, this is only her imagination, and in reality, she's still her meek self. When she leaves work that afternoon, she witnesses Michael Smart hosting a rally for his candidacy. That evening, Nida watches TV during dinner. However, she quickly becomes disheartened by the negative news coverage, so she switches the channel to a show where she finds herself drawn to the performance of Bobby Farrell, a singer. The next day at work, Mr. Duncan, the store owner, expresses his concern to Nida about the smell of her food. He suggests that the aroma may linger in the stockroom and impact the shoe leather, so he advises Nida to bring more normal foods in the future. Despite this discrimination, Nida confirms that she'll keep this in mind. Mr. Duncan expresses relief, mentioning that Vicky will appreciate her cooperation. However, Nida reveals that she had brought a biryani for lunch today, so Mr. Duncan suggests that she eats it in the basement. After the encounter with Mr. Duncan, Nida returns to work, her anger seething as she glares at Vicky, who seems unapologetic. In a burst of rage, Nida smashes Vicky's face into the glass, though this is just her imagination again. Later, she goes to the basement to have her lunch. There, she discovers a collection of newspaper clippings containing reports of tragic accidents. A sense of unease washes over her, urging her to leave. But a gold-embellished drawer catches her attention. As she pulls it open, she accidentally pricks her finger, but this doesn't stop her from feeding her curiosity. Inside the drawer, she discovers a mysterious talisman, unintentionally smearing it with her blood. She then stashes it in her bag and returns to work. That evening, Nida examines the talisman and is horrified when a voice emanates from it, revealing that she has become bound to a powerful demon named Gap by anointing it with her blood. Scared, Nida drops the talisman, but she eventually picks it up when Gap pleads with her to let him finish his speech. Gap starts over, explaining that Nida must carry out 3 human sacrifices over the next 3 days, or the world will end. However, he reassures her that he can help her, but she must first permit him entry. To convince her further, he promises to disappear if she says yes. Nida gets fooled, and Gap exits from the talisman and assumes his physical demon form. Horrified, the woman retreats to a corner, shaking in fear. Seeing her reaction, Gap transforms into Bobby Farrell, the singer Nida had admired earlier. He explains that he has delved into her soul and found that this is the physical appearance she finds appealing. Gap then reiterates the urgency of completing the sacrifices before Mayday. However, Nida is still in shock, refusing to accept that any of this is real. To shatter her belief, the demon conjures a terrifying vision of the apocalypse, engulfing the room in flames and revealing people burning to death. After snapping out of the vision, Nida leaves her apartment to avoid Gap, but he keeps appearing everywhere. Their unending argument leads them to a nearby riverbank, where Gap continues pressuring her into pursuing the killings. He even makes a brick appear on Nida's hand, saying that she can easily bash someone's head with it. Suddenly, a man named Tim Simons appears, asking if Nida is alright. She pleads with him to make Gap leave, but it turns out that the sly demon is only visible to her. Gap then whispers to Nida that Tim deserves to die because of how he treats his daughter, Laura. To further persuade Nida, Gap places her consciousness inside Laura's body, where she witnesses the distressing scene of Tim's treatment of her. Gap adds that Laura will eventually kill herself because of the trauma. Enraged, Nida bashes the brick into Tim's head, causing him to fall into the water and die. The murder goes unnoticed, except for Tim's dog. Overwhelmed, she runs to her apartment and immediately gets sick. Gap attempts to console her by explaining that the talisman has recorded the death, evident by one line now erased from its surface. The following morning, the police are notified of Tim's disappearance. Officer Susie relays this information to Officer Len Fisher, stating that the man is indeed missing as his dog returned home without him. The two immediately head to Tim's house and interview his wife. Laura, on the other hand, seems unfazed by his disappearance. Meanwhile, Gap urges Nida to go to work, saying that her absence might seem suspicious. However, Nida is still overwhelmed by the act she committed, and she's worried that she's gone mad like her mother. To provide comfort, Gap reveals that he is also a newcomer to his role. He explains that that the task at hand is like an initiation and completing it will bring him certain benefits. Nita realizes that she's had enough, so she makes her way to the telephone, intending to turn herself in. However, Gap reminds her that she'll doom billions of lives if she doesn't kill 3 people. Realizing that she has to do this for the greater good, Nita drops the call. She then asks Gap what needs to be done, and he replies that she should go to work like it's a normal day. While she's there, they can decide on who to kill next. Arriving at work late, Nita faces Vicky's rudeness. Witnessing this, Gap suggests that Vicky should be the next target because she also steals from the till. However, Nita disregards his suggestion. As she goes on with her day, Gap relentlessly suggests who should be the next target, starting with an old customer and reasoning that she's almost dead anyway. Meanwhile, Susie informs Len that Tim's body has been found. The two immediately head to the crime scene, where they discover that the victim was clobbered. At Passant's, Vicky flirts with a customer, who Gap suggests can be a potential victim. To persuade Nita, he presents her with a vision of the future, depicting the customer mistreating his future wife. However, Gap clarifies that his fate won't befall Vicky since she'll never get married. Despite Gap's suggestion, Nita distances herself from him, refusing to entertain the idea. Gap reminds her that she must execute 1 killing per day and that time is rapidly running out. That night, Nita only lays on the sofa while watching TV, refusing to proceed with the killings. Fed up, Gap switches the channel to the news, where Nita witnesses a brewing nuclear war against the feuding nations. The demon explains that this is the form that the apocalypse is taking, and it's manifesting by the day. Alarmed, Nita gets up and selects a murder weapon from her kitchen. She thinks about using a knife, but Gap interjects, saying that it doesn't suit her. However, he does believe that she's more of a basher, leading Nita to choose a hammer. To boost her confidence, Gap suggests that she take a little sip of booze. However, Nita doesn't drink, so they head to a nearby bar. Upon arriving, Nita immediately feels out of place, but she proceeds to buy herself drinks anyway. Later, she drinks in a corner where Gap continues his suggestions. One man is a burglar that targets the elderly, but Nita doesn't feel like killing him. With this, Gap comes up with another one, pointing to a woman who allowed her sister to drown before her eyes. Unbeknownst to the two, Julie, the waitress, is observing Nita's unfamiliar face and notices that she's talking to herself. Meanwhile, Gap points to a lonely man who turns out to be Keith Holligan. Seeing the fury rise in Nita's eyes, the demon smiles, knowing they finally have a contender. However, Keith suddenly disappears, prompting Nita and Gap to leave and follow his trail. They find him in a secluded area where he urinates on a wall. Taken aback by the scene, Nita backs away, but Gap suggests that she should kill him there because there isn't anyone around. However, before she can pull the hammer out, Keith notices her. Thinking that she's interested in him, he invites her to his house. Soon after, Nita finds herself in Keith's disgustingly messy room. He then leads her to the bedroom, where he puts on a love-making song to set the mood. However, as he unbuckles his pants, his own smell alarms him, leading him to excuse himself to wash up. With only 6 minutes before midnight, Gap relentlessly pressures Nita to proceed. As Keith returns, he's confronted by Nita, who's gripping a hammer. Surprisingly, he's resigned to his fate, acknowledging that he had anticipated this time would arrive eventually. Without hesitation, Nita swiftly carries out the task and repeatedly bashes Keith's head. Shocked and panicked, Nita clutches the hammer tightly, prepared to make her escape. However, Keith's brother, Chris, unexpectedly arrives, catching her off guard. Aware that leaving a witness behind isn't an option, Gap forcefully insists that Nita also kills Chris. This leads to an intense and thrilling chase around the house, with Chris and Nita fighting each other off. Just then, Chris attempts to hit the woman with the hammer, but she stabs him in the chest, ultimately causing his death. When Nita goes home later that night, she asks Gap what Chris was like, and he replies that he's quite ordinary. However, he reassures her that it's alright because the sacrifices have been carried out. To prove his point, he brings out the talisman but finds that only 1 death was counted, so he immediately calls the higher-ups on the phone. Upon ending the call, Gap regrets to inform Nita that Keith didn't count because he's already killed someone. Apparently, this goes against the rules, meaning that another sacrifice must be carried out. This pisses Nita off, so she declares that she's done with everything. However, Gap reveals the dire consequences of her failure, explaining that not only will the world end, but he will be condemned to an eternal, lonely existence in the boundless cosmic void. Surprisingly, Nita sympathizes with him, as she understands the pain of being alone. With this, she agrees to kill 1 more person. This makes her reflect on her actions, asserting that she never wanted to hurt anyone. However, Gap lets out a playful grin, saying that he can only be summoned by someone corruptible, but not beyond corruption. He knows that a dark sense of anger is bottled up inside her, so he asks who pisses her off most. The following day, Nita plans on killing Vicky. However, this is put on hold when she tends to a customer, which, to her surprise, is Laura. As Nita takes her shoe size, Gap informs her that she saved this child's life, sparing her from a life of pain and guilt. Later, Mr. Duncan accompanies Michael Smart to the store as he's looking for new shoes for his upcoming speech. Michael is assisted by Vicky, whom he asks if he has her vote. However, Vicky states that she'll vote for the National Front because she believes they'll drive immigrants out of the country. To her surprise, Michael reveals that he shares the same standpoint as her, but prefers not to express it openly. This revelation leads to Vicky pledging her vote to Michael. Overhearing this, Nita demands to see Michael's future. Although Gap hesitates due to his higher-ups favoring Michael, he's left with no choice but to comply because of Nita's threats. Soon after, the woman discovers that Michael will become a cruel leader, solidifying her decision to kill him. Just then, Vicky approaches her and demands that she assists a customer. However, Nita bluntly yells at her to do it herself. She then walks out of the store, stealing a bold red jacket that she always wanted. Unfazed, she also replaces it with her blood-stained coat. Elsewhere, Susie and Len investigate the deaths of Keith and Chris. There are no signs of forced entry, but they find Keith's love-making tape in his cassette. Later, they head to the local bar, where they ask Bob, the bartender, if he noticed anything odd the previous night. He mentions that there was an unfamiliar Indian lady. Julie adds that she talked to herself and that she works at Passette's. That night, Nita prepares to kill Michael after his speech when he's driving home alone. However, Len pays her a visit, wanting to interview her about the Holligan brothers. Despite her nervousness, she lets him in and answers his questions with lies. At first, Nita plans to kill Len, but resorts to a calm conversation. She explains that she doesn't usually drink, but made an exception that night because it was her late mother's birthday. Nita even denies knowing Keith, despite Len presenting her with a slip that she wrote for him at Passette's. This concludes Len's interview, and when he leaves, Nita takes this as her cue to go and kill Michael. Unbeknownst to her, the cop is discreetly following her. On their way, Gap recommends killing Len, knowing he'll have a heart attack next year anyway. However, Nita remains steadfast in her plans. After Michael's speech, Nita decides to follow his car. Learning that Len is tailing her, she accelerates and speeds past the barrier gate, leaving the pursuing officer behind. Meanwhile, Gap tries to talk Nita out of the situation, but she tells him to leave if he won't help. Offended, he disappears, leaving Nita to fend for herself. With this, she steps on the gas and bumps her car with Michael's, causing him to swerve out of the road and crash into a tree. However, this doesn't kill him, so she grabs her hammer to finish him. Nita starts relentlessly bashing him with the hammer, but Len catches up to them before she kills him. Len pleads with her to stop, but she reasons that she needs to do it or there'll be war. Nita suddenly quivers in fear as she feels the weight of the situation, allowing Len to pacify her. He then brings her to the station for questioning, where she explains the backstory of Gap, the talisman, and the apocalypse. She also comes clean about her previous murders. However, when Susie shows her the talisman, it has now turned into a normal domino piece. Despite the change in the talisman, her belief in the impending apocalypse remains steadfast. As midnight arrives and nothing catastrophic occurs, the officers are led to think that Nita has gone mad. Soon after, Len and Susie discuss what should be done with Nita. However, their conversation is interrupted by the sound of sirens from outside. Meanwhile, Gap appears before Nita, inviting her to join him in eternal oblivion. He explains that it's a loophole in the rules, as it never mentions the restriction of human companions. Knowing that there's nothing left for her on Earth, Nita agrees to go with Gap. As chaos ensues outside with missiles and bombs exploding, Nita remains calm and unfazed. She finds solace in the fact that she'll spend eternity with a cherished companion, unaffected by the chaos.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.